Hi, everybody. Okay, so hi, welcome back to the channel. Steph is so weird. I'm Steph, and we are going to continue to read The Curse of the Blue Figurine by John Bellairs. Today is the final chapter 12. We're going to find out what happens because, yeah, they're kind of just in a cave at the top of Hellbent Mountain, and bad guy is there, the ghost, Father Bart, and the professor was just disintegrated after digging up. There's a wooden box there on the ground. So let's see what's gonna happen. Here we go. Chapter 12. Johnny was stunned. He was numb with horror. What had happened was so awful that he could hardly believe it. The professor was gone. There was not even a body left, just a heap of clothes. And now the nightmarish face of Father Bart floated closer. "It's your turn now," said the croaking voice. "You must die, so I may return to the sweet land of the living. Stand and face me. I command you to obey." Johnny hesitated. He was frightened half out of his mind, but he was angry too. Ferociously angry. Tears sprang to his eyes. He wanted to throw something, a rock or a boulder, at the horrid mask that floated before his eyes. With a sudden lunge, he reached out and grabbed the small wooden box. He leapt to his feet and threw it. The wood of the box was rotten, and it disintegrated as the box flew through the air. And suddenly, the air was full of dust. The grinning mask crumpled like a paper lantern thrust into a fire. And then there was a blinding flash of red light and a deep boom that seemed to come from afar, far down into the bowels of the mountain. The floor of the cave began to shake and tremble and jump crazily about. Clots of dirt and pebbles fell from the ceiling of the cave. Johnny looked around, panic-stricken. What could he do? Suddenly the floor of the cave heaved, and Johnny was sent sprawling. He fell across something soft, something that cried out with a loud, crabby voice. "For the love of God, will you just stop kicking me? What do you think I am, anyway?" Johnny could not believe his ears. The voice was the professor's voice. He was there, alive, lying under Johnny. Well, with a loud, triumphant yell, Johnny scrambled to his feet. He was so excited and overjoyed that he hardly knew what he was doing. "Professor, is that really you?" The professor, the familiar, raspy voice responded, "Of course it's me. Who else would it be up here in this disgusting, dank, smelly cave? I came all the way up here to rescue you, and the least you could do is..." The professor's speech was cut off by a sickening jolt. Once again, the cave floor heaved, and more rocks and pebbles came raining down. Now the professor was on his feet. "Outside!" he yelled, and grabbed Johnny's arm. He hauled him out through the mouth of the cave. The mountain went on shaking and shivering. It was very dark outside, and it was still raining. But from somewhere far above them, Johnny and the professor heard a drumming, thundering roar that grew louder and louder by the second. Whew, in terror, they clutched each other and waited. It was a rock slide, another rock slide. Down the side of the mountain, boulders came crashing, thundering, and rolling. The din was terrific. Johnny and the professor put their hands over their ears and closed their eyes. Any second now, they would be killed, crushed by tons of rock, or so they thought. But then the din died away. From the far below, they heard splashes and more rumbling. Then came silence. Johnny opened his eyes and took his hands away from his ears. He was soaked with rain, and it was still black as pitch outside, but he knew that the avalanche had passed them by. He turned to the professor excitedly. "Hey, professor!" he yelled. "Hey, we're safe! We're safe! The ghost is gone! Hey, you were great! You really were! I thought you were dead, but you're alive! It's wonderful! Whee!" He waved his arms and started dancing around on the grass. The professor stood shock still. He smiled faintly. "Oh, I assure you, it was nothing," he said with a modest wave of his hand, and then he fainted dead away. When the professor woke up, he found Johnny kneeling over him. He looked very anxious. It was getting light out. The sky was blue again, and the sun was rising from a reddish haze over on the other side of the wide valley. Birds were twittering in a crooked little juniper tree that grew near the mouth of the cave. Are you all right, Professor? Johnny asked. The professor sat up. He harumphed and looked at Johnny, and then he quickly looked away. Plainly, he was embarrassed. Fainting was not the sort of thing he usually did. I'm perfectly all right, he snapped, brushing dirt off his sleeves. And by the way, what is it all that oh whoa. And by the way, what is all that nincompoopy about me being dead? Do I look dead to you? Eh, do I? Johnny explained to the professor as well as he could what he had seen, or rather, what he thought he had seen inside the cave. Well, 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 said the professor. He cocked his head to one side and looked thoughtful. It must have been an illusion. Old Shag Nasty must have known that he that we had him in a corner. We were within an inch of victory when we found that box, and it had his ashes in it. He wanted you to despair and give up. I'm so glad you didn't. So am I, said Johnny. Once again, there were tears in his eyes, and he shuddered and he realized how narrow their escape had been. The professor got to his feet. Fussily, he brushed off the seat of his pants and his trouser legs. He glanced this way and that. By the way, he said, what was all that god awful noise? When I woke up from whatever happened to me, it seemed like the whole bloody mountain was coming down around our ears. Johnny pointed off to the right. It was not hard to see the path that the rock slide had made. A great, raw gash ran down the rugged face of the mountain. The falling stones and boulders had wiped out what was left of the trail. Johnny and the professor would have to be rescued by somebody, somehow. Heavenly days, McGee! Exclaimed the professor in wonder. He walked to the edge of the drop off and looked down. The path of the rock slide continued down the steep side of the mountain. Far down, near the bottom, you could see where trees had been mowed down by the rolling boulders. The professor squinted and strained to see, but his eyes were not good for distances. Tell me, John, he said, beckoning for Johnny to come closer. Are those boulders in the lake way down there? Johnny walked to the edge and looked. Yeah, I guess so, he said uncertainly. He turned and pointed up. They came from up there. The professor looked where Johnny was pointing, and then, in a flash, it hit him. He knew what had happened. The hag had come down. The jutting, shelving boulders that formed the face of the hag had been dislodged by the earthquake, and now they were down in Hag Lake, thousands of feet below. The professor started to laugh. He couldn't help it. It all seemed terribly funny. He thought about all the things that had been named for the hag. He thought about hag view cottages and hag comfy cabins and pieces of pine scented soap shaped like the hag, and most of all, the hag-tooth Harry's trained bears. It was just a stitch. It really was. When the professor's laughing fit had died down, Johnny asked timidly, Did the ghost make the earthquake happen? The professor was startled by this question. Now all the things that had happened last night came flooding back into his mind, and he grew serious again. Yes, he said, nodding. Or rather, his passing caused the earthquake to shake. Or rather, his passing caused the earth to shake. But he's gone now, gone for good. At least, I hope. The professor paused. He had been gazing vaguely around while he talked. Now he found that he was looking at a funny shaped outcropping of rock that rose above the entrance to the cave. The morning sun was rising on the eastern flank of the mountain, and it touched the ragged finger of rock with golden fire. The rock looked like an angel. It had wings and a head and even something that looked a bit like an outstretched hand. Interred by angels, muttered the professor, nodding. One was up there, and the other was a coin. Clever, clever! But I wonder who planted him up here. Who did the burying, I mean? Johnny had not understood anything that the professor said. Not that it mattered much to him at the moment. He was just happy to be alive. He did not understand how he managed to travel from his bed at the motel to this wild, lonely place in the mountains. But he knew it all had something to do with the ghost of Father Bart, who had turned out to be real after all. And he also knew, or hoped, that the professor would explain everything to him in good time. Right now, however, there were other problems. How are we going to get down, Professor? Johnny asked. The professor made a puckery face. Oh, I suspect that we will have company shortly, he said dryly. Earthquakes are not common up here in the White Mountains, and when the local yokels see what has happened to their chief tourist attraction, there'll be lots of people swarming all over the mountain, taking pictures and saying tisk tisk, and standing around with their mouths hanging open. So don't worry. In the meantime, however, we will have to wait. It'll be boring, I know, but it beats plunging thousands of feet to our death. Don't you agree? Johnny agreed. So he sat down on the dewy grass with the professor, and they talked about this and that as the sun rose higher and higher. In the middle of their conversation, the professor got up and went into the cave. He came back with a slab of stone that had the gold coin embedded in it. He remarked sadly to Johnny that Elizabethan gold angels were much prized by coin collectors. Then he added that the coin had lain for years over the grave of a wicked sorcerer. And after the professor took the slab to the edge of the precipice and heaved it over, coin and all, then he went back and sat down next to Johnny on the grass and talked some more. Presently, they began to hear a whip whap sound in the air and the whirring of motors. They looked up and saw a helicopter. It was coming down over the top of Hellbent Mountain. Johnny and the professor sprang to their feet and began yelling and waving frantically. The helicopter hovered briefly near the top of the mountain, and then, slowly, it moved closer. It floated down onto the grassy patch while its whirring propellers stirred up a mighty wind. The engine sounds died, and the professor spun to a halt. A door in the cabin of the copter opened, and a state trooper climbed out. He was a man about 60 years old with a leathery, seamed, sunburnt face and a gray crew cut. He wore the green uniform of the New Hampshire State Police, and when he opened his mouth, he talked with a heavy New Hampshire accent. Hi there, he said, waving. I bet you guys was wondering how you was gonna get down, wasn't you? He turned and peered down over the edge of the chasm, over the edge of the chasm, when he let a long, low whistle and shook his head gravely. Gonna be hard in the tourist business, he said mournfully. What in the heck you think people will come up here for to see now? The professor thought of the towering, rugged mountains and how they looked in autumn, when their sides were alight with colors, yellow and orange and red. He thought of the mountain streams and steep gorges and the layers of brown needles covering the forest floor. He thought of the mountains in moonlight and lonely night drives along the Kankampagus Highway. Oh, I imagine there'll be something to look at, he said sarcastically. There's always Hagtooth Harry's trained bears, after all. The policeman sighed and shook his head. Kids will be awful disappointed, he said. Then he added as an afterthought, you folks like a ride back, would you? The professor and Johnny climbed in the helicopter with the trooper and rode back with him to the motel. Johnny enjoyed the ride tremendously. He had only been in an airplane once before in his life, and he had never ridden a helicopter. The professor closed his eyes and spent his time trying to remember the kings and queens of England, in which one came after another. After an amazingly short ride, the copter set them down on the front lawn of the Hag View cottages. But as soon as they stepped out onto the solid ground again, Johnny and the professor ran into more trouble. A state police cruiser was pulling up in front of the cottage they were staying in. The owner, a bald, red-faced man with a big, overhanging beer belly, was talking excitedly with two policemen. When he saw the two missing persons walking toward him, he nearly had a conniption fit. Jesus! He exclaimed in a loud foghorn voice. Where'd you two come from? God, I thought you two was at the bottom of old Hag Lake or someplace. What happened to you, huh? On the spur of the moment, the professor made up a cock and bull story. He explained to the owner that Johnny was nervous and what and he explained to the owner that Johnny was nervous and excitable. He had been under a doctor's care recently because of the loss of his mother. Last night, for no reason at all, Johnny had plunged into the night and the professor had followed after. And then the two of them had gotten trapped by the earthquake and had to be rescued. The owner accepted the story. At least he said that he did, but he glowered suspiciously at the professor. The professor didn't know it, but he had been under suspicion from the time he signed the register in the motel's office. He had signed it Roderick Childermas, PhD. As far as the owner was concerned, all PhDs were kooks and communists and God knows what else. As for the policemen, they were just glad they could call off the search and go home. After the policeman had gone and everyone had calmed down a bit, Johnny and the professor packed their bags and got ready to leave. The professor went to the motel office and paid the bill, and off they went. They drove straight back to Dustin Heights, stopping only in the town of Rochester to grab lunch at a drive-in. When the professor's car pulled up in front of the Dixons' house, Grandma and Grandpa knew right away that something had happened. The travelers had come back from their trip 2 days early, and they had come back suddenly, without calling, without explanations. At first, Johnny and the professor were very, very secretive and close-mouthed about what had happened. Finally, though, the professor admitted that something very strange and mysterious and scary had happened. And he said that he'd tell the Dixons the whole story in 3 days' time. In the meantime, he needed to make a few phone calls and confer with a friend of his. Then, after grabbing a Bible out of the bookcase and making Johnny swear to secrecy on it, the professor left. 3 days passed. During this time, Johnny stayed at home. He did jigsaw puzzles and played cribbage and checkers with Grandpa. Meanwhile, across the street, the professor was busy. First, he called up Dr. Melkonian and chewed him out. Without giving the doctor a chance to get a word in edgewise, he told him that he was a pompous, posturing, bearded hogsworther who ought to have his psychiatric license revoked. He accused him of mystagogic muckification and pointless prattle. And he said that he'd ask for his money back if he thought that there was any chance it'd be returned. He ended up by slamming the receiver down hard in the doctor's ear. This little rant did not make a whole lot of sense, but it left the professor feeling relieved and curiously satisfied. Next, the professor hired a cleaning lady to whip his house into shape so he could have visitors in. Finally, he made a long-distance call to an old friend of his up in Durham, New Hampshire, the town where the University of New Hampshire is. On a Friday night at around 8 o'clock, Grandma, Grandpa, and Johnny went across the street to the professor's house. When he met them at the door, he was wearing a red damask smoking jacket that smelled of mothballs, and he was smoking Balkan Sombri tobacco in a pipe. He had decided that cigarettes were bad for his health. The professor ushered his guests into the living room. A bright fire burned in the fireplace, and the crystal pendants on the Ormolu, whatever, candlesticks on the mantel glistened and glittered. In an easy chair by the fire, someone was sitting, a stranger. He was a tall, weedy man with a fluff of white hair on his head. He wore big, goggly, horn-rimmed glasses, and his long, pointed nose was bent and rigid. The shoulders of his tweed jacket were covered with dandruff, and the elbows had leather patches. Of course they did. His pants were baggy and shapeless, and his long, pointed toes looked as if they were made out of cardboard. "This is Professor Charles Coote," said Professor Chaldermast. Pointing toward the man. "He is an old friend of mine, and he has written a very important book on Egyptian magic. He also knows a great deal about Ushapti, of which we shall have more to say later." Oh no. Professor Coote stood up and made 3 nods of his head, one toward Johnny, one toward Grandma, and one toward Grandpa. Then he sat down and folded his hands in his lap. Professor Childermas led Grandma and Grandpa over to the sofa and asked them to sit down. Johnny sat down on the straight chair and squirmed impatiently. He did not know what the professor was going to say or do, and he was impatient and extremely curious. The professor took his pipe out of his mouth and harumphed. He looked around as if he didn't know where he was, and then, with a brash dash, he went to the sideboard and came back with a rattling tray full of bottles and glasses. He set the tray down on the coffee table with a jolt, and then he backed away into the middle of the room. Entertaining people was a chore for the professor. He didn't do it often, and whenever he did it, he acted as if he was trying to get things over with as quickly as possible. Well, just help yourselves, he said, waving his hand awkwardly. There's sherry for those who drink it, and imitation non-alcoholic sherry flavored punch for those who like that sort of a thing. Just help yourselves. When this little speech was over, the professor retreated to the fireplace and stood there, fidgeting. Professor Coot got up and loped across the room to the coffee table. He poured himself a glass of sherry and went back to his chair. Then everyone else started to help themselves. Johnny wanted a glass of sherry, but he could tell from the look on Grandma's eyes that he'd better not have some of the other stuff instead. When everybody had something to drink, the professor poured himself a glass of sherry. He drowned it all in one gulp, wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, and slammed the glass down on the mantelpiece. After some harumphing and nose blowing, he turned again to face his company and began to speak. He had called them here, he said, to clear up some of the mysteries of the last few months. First, he wanted Johnny to speak. Who, me, Professor? Johnny asked, tapping his chest with his finger. Professor nodded. Yes, you, my friend. I want you to begin at the beginning and tell these folks everything you can remember about the whole crazy business that you had been mixed up in. Johnny thought about the figurine that he had stolen from the church. He glanced nervously at Grandma and Grandpa. Do I have to tell everything? He asked. Yes, said the professor firmly. Everything. Don't leave out a jot or a tittle or a smidget. And don't worry, no one's going to disown you or clap you in irons. Please begin. So Johnny told his tale. He told about how he had stolen the figurine from the church. He told about Mr. Beard and the ring and the weird and ghostly things that had happened to him after he put the ring on his finger and began saying the prayer to Thoth and Taurus. Finally, he told about what had happened to him and the professor up on Hellbent Mountain at midnight amid lightning and thunder and rain. Of course, since Johnny had been unconscious or sleepwalking during part of this last episode, the professor had to fill in details. He did this in a very dramatic way, with lots of gestures. Finally, when Johnny and the professor had both said their piece, silence fell. There was no sound in the room but the crackling of the fire. Then Grandma stirred restlessly in her seat. She gave Grandpa a hard nudge in the ribs and her elbow and said to him in an accusing tone, How about that, Mr. Smarty Pants? Mr. Know-it-all? You're the one that said the ghost was just an old foo-foo-raw, and I was just an old superstitious Irish lady. What do you say now, eh? Grandpa groaned. I think I'm going to be hearing about this for the next 6 months, he said, and he gave Johnny a humorous look as if to say, What are you going to do? Grandma turned to the professor next. She gave him her best glower, as if she felt everything that had happened was his fault. Them spiders, she began, wrinkling up her nose in disgust. Was they something that came from the blue do-digger in the black box? The professor turned to Professor Coot and grinned. You're on, Charlie, he said. Help the lady. Professor Coot spoke up. Professor Coot spoke up. He sounded very scholarly and precise. In a matter of speaking, yes, they were a manifestation of the forces, the evil forces, that dwell inside the blue figurine. Insects have often been associated with evil spirits. Beelzebub was one of the 7 devils, and his name means Lord of the Flies. What was the blue thing anyway? Grandpa asked. Did old Bart make it, or was it a souvenir? Once again, Professor Coot responded, No. In spite of that label he put on to confuse people, it was a genuine Ushtava. Nope. It was a genuine... Nope. No, in spite of the label he put on to confuse people, it was a genuine Ushapti, a tomb figure, but it was not Egyptian. It came from Kush, which is an ancient kingdom far up the Nile, beyond Egypt. The kings of Kush conquered Egypt in the 8th century BC, and they ruled there for a while. When they were driven out, they carried Egyptian customs back to Kush with them. Then, when they were back in their own little kingdom, the Kushtis pretended that they were Egyptians. They followed Egyptian religious practices, wrote Egyptian hieroglyphics, and they made Ushapti. Of course, the workmanship of these ushapti was rather crude. He turned to the professor and smiled patronizingly. No doubt, Roderick, he added. That is why you failed to see that the ushapti was genuine. A genuine ancient object, I mean. The professor scowled. Oh, don't be silly, Charlie, he snapped. I wouldn't have known a genuine Egyptian ushapti if it had bit me on the rear. But like most scholars, I like to pretend that I know more than I really know. So I screwed up. Shut your trap and have more sherry. There was an awkward silence. Professor Coot blew his nose, and then he made a dash for the coffee table. He refilled his glass and hurried back to his seat. Grandpa still had some questions to ask. Look, Rod, he said, pointing a long, freckled finger at the professor. If that blue doohickey was really ancient, where old Bart get his hands on it? Do you think that guy, that wood carver, gave it to him? The professor stuck his hands in his pockets and shrugged. I think that the wood carver must have given the figure to Father Bart. By the way, would you care to see it? Or rather, what's left of it? Grandma, Grandpa, and Johnny all said, yeah, or sure, you're Dan tootin' together. The professor walked over the armchair where Professor Coot was sitting. Down on the floor, hidden by the shadow of the armchair, lay a large black book. Stooping, the professor picked the book up and carried it over into the center of the room. Johnny, Grandma, and Grandpa all leaned forward eagerly to look as the professor flipped the heavy cover back. Inside the book lay the shattered, charred fragments of the blue figurine. My gosh, Johnny exclaimed. Did you do that to it, Professor? The professor shook his head. Nope. I found the figurine like this when I got back home from our trip. I think it must have happened when you scattered the ashes of our dear old friend, Father Bart. The ring got the same treatment. I took it out of my pocket when I paid our bill at the motel, and it looked like this. He reached into the pocket of his smoking jacket and took out a twisted wad of blackened metal. The stone was gone, he added as he showed the remains of the ring around. It vaporized or exploded or something. I found little bits of fingernail parings and hair. I think that's what they were. They were clinging to the metal part of the ring, and I imagine they were under the stone. I burned them in my fireplace, which is the proper thing to do with such rubbish, I believe. Yes, said Professor Coot, nodding. I believe you did the right thing. He smiled prissily and added, you also ought to bury the remains of that ushapti and the ring. Bury the pieces under the roots of a yew tree in a cemetery by the light of a new moon. That is the method of disposing of cursed objects that is recommended by the great astronomer Regiomontanus. He says that you mean Johann Mugler or of Koringinsberg, don't you? Said the professor, interrupting. That's his real name, you know. Professor Coot gave his friend a dirty look. Yes, I know what his real name is, but it would be stuffy and pedantic to call him Johannes Mueller, wouldn't it? And we wouldn't want to be stuffy and pedantic, would we? Professor Coot had been looking for some way of getting even for the shut your trap remark. Now he sat back in his chair, satisfied. Johnny spoke up again at this point. There was still a lot about this business that seemed puzzling to him. How come old Father Bart wanted to kill me? He asked. Was it just because he was evil or what? The professor studied the burning tobacco in the bowl of his pipe. I think, he said slowly, that it was going to be a case of a life for a life. Bart was dead, you see. He was an evil sorcerer, and he made some mistake in the middle of his sorcering. What he did wrong, we'll never know, but it got him killed. What he did wrong, we'll never, ever know, but it got him killed. His body was burnt to ashes, and it was buried up in the mountains by whom? The wood carver? The powers of darkness? I don't suppose we'll ever know. But to continue, Bart was dead, and his spirit still hung around on the earth. He haunted St. Michael's Church, and he would have gone on haunting it, harmlessly, forever, I suppose. But you took the lid off the cauldron, Johnny. You disregarded the warning and took the figure out of the church. A church is a sacred place. It can help the powers of evil in check. It can keep the powers of evil in check. But once you remove the figurine from the protection of the church, then, quite literally, all hell broke loose. And what did our old Bart want? He wanted to be alive again in the world. So he appeared to you as Mr. Beard, and he gave you a ring. And the ring gave you power, power against bullies like Eddie. But that was not its real purpose. No, the ring gave Bart power over you. It was part of his plan. With the ring on your finger, you were going to die at midnight in Dustin Park, and he was going to come back to the world of the living. In what form, I wonder? As young Johnny Dixon? As Father Bart? As Mr. Beard? God only knows. Johnny shuddered. He and I would die if I took the ring off. Johnny shuddered. He said I would die if I took the ring off my finger. That's why I kept it on. The professor grimaced. That was just a lot of threatening. Folderoy, my boy. Folderoy? Folderol. Folderol. The professor grimaced. That was just a lot of threatening folderol, my boy. You could have taken the ring off whenever you wanted to. Actually, the situation was just the opposite of what that old devil said it was. You would die if you did keep the ring on your finger. So it was really very fortunate that the professor's voice trailed away. He suddenly became very gloomy and bit his lip. What's the matter, Professor? Johnny asked anxiously. The professor heaved a deep, despairing sigh. He walked to the fireplace and knocked his pipe out against one of the andreons. Oh, nothing, he said sadly, nothing much. It just suddenly occurred to me that Dr. Melkonian probably saved your life. He took the ring off, as you know, when you were asleep in his office. If you had still had the ring on when we went to Dustin Park at midnight, the old buzzard would have made short work of you, and of me, too, perhaps. And was I nice to Dr. Melkonian? Was I grateful? No. I chewed him out over the phone because he was wrong about what was wrong with you. Sometimes I think I'm really not a very nice person. Tears came to the professor's eyes. It looked as if he was going to break down and bawl right there in front of everybody. Johnny jumped to his feet. There were tears in his eyes, too. No, Professor, he exclaimed loudly. You're not a bad guy. Really, you're not. If you hadn't come up to rescue me, I'd be dead. You stood right up to the ghost, and you're a real brave guy. Honest, I mean it. Don't cry. Please don't. The professor blinked and sniffled. He took out a red cotton handkerchief and blew his nose loudly. You think I'm okay after all? He asked, looking around uncertainly. Of course you're okay. Sorry. Of course you're okay, put in Professor Coot. He reached up from where he was sitting and patted the professor reassuringly on the arm. You have one of the filthiest tempers I've ever seen in my life, but when you're not screaming and raging or throwing the furniture around, you're an extremely kind and thoughtful person. Of course, he added, poking a forefinger at the professor, it would help your reputation if you'd sit down tomorrow and write a nice note to Dr. Melkonian explaining how you really feel now and apologizing to him for your brutish behavior. I mean, it would be the decent thing to do. The professor took off his glasses and dabbed his eyes with his soggy handkerchief. Then he put his glasses back on and looked around the room. Everyone was smiling at him. Grandpa was grinning and purring contemplatively at his pipe. Even Grandma, whose normal expression was a frown, was smiling now. The professor harumphed and rubbed his elbows. He stuck his pipe back in his mouth and tried to act stuffy. Humph, he snorted. Well, now, is there anything more I can get for anybody, eh? There certainly is, said Professor Coot in a dry, sarcastic voice. I believe it is the custom to serve cookies and other edible goodies with sherry. And indeed, when I was in your kitchen earlier this evening, I saw a plate loaded with such items. It was sitting on the counter by the sink, and that's where it still is. The professor's face turned red. He slapped his forehead with the flat of his hand. Phooey, he roared. I knew I'd forgotten something. Just a minute. He turned on his heel and dashed out of the room. A moment later, he returned, in his hands with a china platter, and it was loaded with all sorts of tasty things. Peanut butter cookies and chocolate brownies with chocolate frosting and chocolate candies, creams the professor hated caramel fillings, and piles of bonbons on paper doilies. Then the professor went back and came in a second time. This time he was carrying a plate with a Schuster tort on it. Nope. This time he was carrying a plate with a Chester tort on it. A Chester tort is a kind of super chocolate cake. It has lots of layers, and the spaces between the layers are filled with apricot jam. And on the outside is lots of rich, dark chocolate frosting. The professor had made the the saucer tort the night before, and he had hidden it away in a cupboard to bring out as a surprise. But amid the fuss and flurry of getting ready for guests, he had forgotten all about it. Now that the serious part of the evening was over with, everybody ate and drank and talked and had a good time. Later, Professor Coot wandered upstairs and, while looking for the bathroom, accidentally discovered the fuss closet. The professor had never told him about the closet, so naturally, he wondered what it was for. But when he went downstairs and asked, the professor told him that he was thinking of becoming a Buddhist monk in his old age and was practicing meditation. This explanation did not quite fit the sign on the inside of the closet door, but Professor Coot was not one to pry, so he let it go at that. Then the professor sat down at the piano in the living room and played old songs, and everybody joined in, singing along. Grandma insisted that the professor play just a song at twilight, and he did, and Grandma got very weepy because that had been her mother's favorite song. And then the professor played the Star-Spangled Banner and told everybody that the evening was over and they had to go home. Because that's what they play on the TV. They say, this is the end of our broadcast evening. Or the end of our broadcast day. Yeah, anyway. God, this is a little tedious. All right. All right, it's 2 pages, people. We can do it. Out on the front walk, under the stars, the professor was saying goodbye to Johnny. Professor Coot was upstairs in bed. He was staying overnight at the professor's house and was going back to Durham in the morning. Grandma and Grandpa had already gone back to their house. Johnny didn't want to go. Not yet. He kept thinking about that there were more things that he had wanted to ask the professor, but he was so sleepy and stuffed with goodies that he could not think what the things might be. Well, John, said the professor amiably, you've had quite an adventure. Did you think it was as good as the ones you listened to on the radio, Johnny made a face. He was thinking that adventures were fine as long as you could sit in your living room and listen to or read about them. You know what I wish? He said suddenly. What? What do you wish? I wish I had a nice, safe kind of magic ring that would keep Eddie Tompkins off my back. The professor shook his head vigorously. No, you don't. You don't wish that at all. If you had a ring like that, it would be like carrying a loaded pistol around all the time. Sooner or later, you'd be tempted to use it in some evil way, and then you'd be horribly sorry afterwards. People don't know when they're well off. I knew a fellow in college, and he was fun to be around, but he was all weak and wasty and didn't have any muscles. So he worked out with weights and ran for miles, and he turned into a real rough and tough bruiser. He also turned into one of the biggest bores on the face of the earth. All he ever could talk about was how he had turned himself into a muscle man. Stay like you are. You'll be a lot. Johnny! Johnny! Johnny turned and looked. It was Grandma. She was standing on the front steps and her hands cupped to her mouth. What is it, Grandma? He yelled. What's the matter? It's your father. He's on the phone. He's calling all the way from someplace I've never heard of. Come on, hurry. Johnny was overjoyed. He hadn't heard from his dad in a long time, and he had been wondering what had happened to him. Oh my gosh, he exclaimed excitedly. Hey, Professor, I gotta go. Thanks for everything. Goodbye. He started across the street, but at the curve he came to a sudden halt. He turned and gazed forlorningly at the professor. He had just realized that his dad would never, ever believe the stuff that had happened to him. The professor had read Johnny's thoughts. He started to chuckle. What's the matter, John? He asked. Johnny did not see what was so funny. What am I going to tell him, Professor? My dad, I mean, what do I say? The professor thought a second. Tell him that you got all A's in school, except for the D you got in penmanship. And don't lie about the D. It's always best to tell the truth. Johnny stared in astonishment. Then he burst out laughing. Still laughing, he turned and ran back across the street toward the lighted doorway of his house. And that's it. That's it. That's it. That's it. Like, I feel like it was just so anticlimactic. Did you feel that way? Because, like, he disintegrated. And it was exciting to come in to today's chapter and to end it and stuff, and to find out what was going to go on. I mean, like,
Like, dude, all he did was shout at him, pick up the box and throw it at him, and then suddenly there's an earthquake, and then he just falls through the floor or whatever, and now he's with the professor, and, like, everything is okay, and then they just talk, and, like, that's it. Like, and the professor or that the evil goat, your Father Bart just disappears. I'm bummed. That was I mean, and then it was so much about all, like, the sitting and the sherry and just like, this is too long of an epilogue. I don't think I wanna read any more of them. I think I wanna go to the Dark Rises series by Susan Cooper because I love that series. I know it's gotta hold up. This I am sad that it did not hold up for my memory. I appreciated how it read though, like, because it was always, like, 3 things, like, or 4 things even, like, the way it described stuff. Like, I thought that was neat. Like, that was nice. And I learned a lot of words, but I don't agree with, like, there's too much religion and stuff in it, and I'm not into it. So, yeah, I don't know. Yeah, I think I'm gonna have to move on. I don't wanna read any more in the series. I do remember loving it when I was younger, though, but it's gonna have to stay nostalgic and, just fall away, I guess. It's because, yeah, I don't know. All right, that was it. That was the end. Let me know what you think in the comments. I hope you had fun. I had fun reading it. I think I got a little fast here and there, and some of those words I just stumbled over, but whatever. It's all good. If you liked it, like and subscribe. We'll see you on the next one, whatever that is, and whenever that is. And oh, the excitement. Uh, thanks very much. See you next time. Bye.